Good afternoon, good evening, and welcome everyone. My name is Julia Fisher, and I'm the Special Projects Coordinator here at the Twinsburg Public Library. Thank you so much for joining us for Everything You Wanted to Know About Local Government But Were Afraid to Ask. This is part 3 of our 3-part series, and tonight we will be covering issues and funding in local governments. The first session covered the history of local governments, and the second session covered the structures. If you were present for either of those, welcome back. Thank you so much for joining us again. And if you missed either one, they are both currently available to watch on our library's YouTube channel, and I will send the link to both of those in the chat in just a minute. Because this is a Zoom webinar, you will not be able to turn your camera on or unmute yourself, but you can feel free to send messages through the chat button or the Q&A button. I will be monitoring these throughout the evening. If you have a clarifying question on something Dr. Keller is talking about, I will interrupt him to ask the question. If it's a more detailed question, I will save it for the Q&A session at the end. The presentation will take around 40 to 45 minutes, and then we will have 15 to 20 minutes at the end for questions. This presentation is being recorded and will be uploaded to YouTube with the other two. Your name and image will not be recorded, but if you submit any questions that are read during the Q&A session, the content of your question will be included in the recording. If you have any questions or issues during the event, please send me a message through the chat. Also, a quick note that I'm coming to you from my home office and my internet can sometimes be a little shaky, so if I freeze, I deeply apologize. And if there are any other technical issues on our end, we apologize in advance and promise to try to fix it as quickly as possible. And now it is my honor to introduce for the third time our exceptional speaker. Dr. Larry Keller is an associate professor emeritus at the Levin College of Urban Affairs at Cleveland State University. Dr. Keller received a PhD in public administration from the American University and a JD from Vanderbilt University. Prior to joining CSU, he taught at Fisk University, University of Kansas, and the University of Colorado at Denver. He has decades of experience in studying and working with local governments, city councils, charter commissions, and charter review commissions. We are so lucky to have him here with us again today. And Dr. Keller, take it away.
Thank you, Julia. Tonight we're going to look at the more of a general history. The first part of this 3-part series was a look specifically at the history of local government. What has happened is local government, as American government in general, I would argue, has been caught up in trying to deal with complexity. And I will talk about what that means and how it has changed so quickly over time. And we as a nation are having a very difficult time, I would argue, dealing with complexity. And we are one of the more complex countries in the world, and we're the 3rd country in the world in terms of population. Only China and India have more people than the United States. What complexity comes from is what I would call modern times. And they arise quickly in the United States after the Civil War, specifically the end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction ended in 1876 as part of a bargain around a contested presidential election. Sounds familiar, unfortunately. And part of that bargain was to end Reconstruction, and that changed the focus of a national government from Reconstruction to, I would argue, cities and industries, especially the Republican Party. The Republican Party started right before the Civil War. Lincoln was the first Republican president, and dealing with the Civil War. He only survived the Civil War by about a week or so, and so really never dealt with Reconstruction. But the end of Reconstruction was 1876, and that's when we began to get modern, what I would argue is modern times. The modern times can be dated, in a sense, from the rise of electricity. There was no electricity as we know it until the mid-1880s. What made for modern society? Railroads, industry, and cities. Railroads replaced canals. It's kind of fascinating. If you ride around Ohio, you can see a lot of the remains of the canals, which were the primary transportation mode prior to railroads. The problem with canals is they freeze in the winter, and that means there was no deliveries and no output from factories during that time because things couldn't be shipped. The railroads changed industry and made modern industry possible because they run on a regular schedule year round. And because industry then could run on an annual schedule, people could then have jobs that would be last over the year, and that helped promote cities. At the same time, that is the end of Reconstruction, the United States had unlimited immigration. It's interesting to study the immigration policies in the Revolution, and it would really be useful to do that given a lot of the misinformation on immigration. But immigration was very important in the early parts of the United States after Reconstruction because it brought factory workers to the United States. In 1902, 6 million immigrants entered a country that was only about 6 million people. In most large cities, Cleveland was an example. If you went to a factory, you probably did not hear any English. I remember about 2 decades ago, I walked in Los Angeles, and for about 20 blocks, I heard no English at all. It's fascinating. Immigrants tended to live in ghettos. They were not slums. They were ghettos. That is, they had amenities and institutions. Slums lack institution and amenities. So the first urban revolution created a walking city with year-round industry, providing jobs to immigrants who lived in ghettos, that is, neighborhoods that were ethnically identified. The other part of the complexity, it comes after the Second World War. The Second World War was one of the best things that ever happened in the United States, which is an odd statement to make in some ways. But we totally mobilized for the war, suffered almost no consequences to our country from the war. In contrast, 95% of the urban structures in Germany were destroyed by bombing. We had maybe one bomb that came on a, believe it or not, a kind of a balloon thing in Oregon, but otherwise we were, as a country, not affected by the war. However, because we mobilized, everybody went to work. My mother took an industrial job in an aircraft factory. They could not spend any money because no consumer goods were not available. Led to a savings rate of about 25%. In most of my lifetime, the savings rate in the United States has been around 0%. That is, people who are not saving. However, in World War II, the savings rate was 25%. The consequence was, after World War II, we had a workforce. We had modern factories because the national government built a lot of the factories. The IX Center in Cleveland was built to produce tanks in the United States. So we had a modern industrial infrastructure, modern industrial workforce with lots of savings. So my parents, I think when they bought their first home, we lived in a double for the first 5 years of my life. But when they bought their first home, I think their mortgage was like 1%. That spurred this, what I call the second urban revolution, where people began moving out to the suburbs because of the prosperity following World War II. The federal government's main problem, believe it or not, was what to do with a budgetary surplus. Therefore, we could build roads, we could fund universities. The GI Bill of Rights allowed former members of the military to go to college free. 12 million people served in the armed forces in World War II. That's a large population going to college. So we have modern universities dating from this time which is after World War II until 1973 or so. In 1973, we had the oil embargo, and we had one of the first big busts in real estate. And that's why I talk about the second urban revolution from basically 1950 to 1973. My parents rode that wave. They moved to the suburbs, they could buy the homes. Mortgages were very inexpensive. And so we ended up with a complex society, and that's what I'm going to talk about. But another way to look at the history, and I think a way to make it more real for people. And you get a sense of this if you get into ancestry. My wife is one of the top people in ancestry.com and able to use it. If you don't do ancestry studies, the only recognition you have of your family is usually 2 generations on either side of yourself, from your grandparents to your grandkids. But it's useful to look at what did the country look like for my family. My grandfather is born in 1889. He's born only a few years after electricity is made available in New York City. They had no electricity in the home in which he was born. However, he lived to watch people walk on the moon. Can you imagine the amount of change in his lifetime? Much more than I will ever experience, as he went from getting electricity to watching people land on the moon. At the time my grandfather was born in 1889, there were 63 million Americans. My grandfather's son, my father, was born in 1919. And by that time, the country was 106,500,000 approximately. That is almost double the population when my grandfather was born. So in one generation, you had 60 million new Americans. The third generation, and that's myself, the son of my father, obviously. I was born in 1941. I was actually born right after Pearl Harbor, about 16 days. And I was born into a country of 123 million. My daughter, which is the granddaughter of the grandfather, born in 1969, she was born in a country of 205 million people. The great-grandson of my grandfather, my father really, my grandson was born in 2001, and he's born in a country of 282 million people. I think I said 205,000 is 205 million for my daughter. But her children are born in a country of 282 million, 77 million more people in that short period of time. In 2020, the U.S. population was 331 million. So in a few generations of my family, the United States has gone from 63 million people to 331 million people. That's a considerable change, obviously, significant change. And I think it's part of our political problems today is trying to deal with that consequence. Not only is the population larger, it's more diverse as well. What happened to local government during all of that change is what I call institutional conglomeration. That is, all of those historic units of government that we talked about in the first presentation still exist. The suburban migration moved into these old governmental units. As a result, if you look at any map of Ohio, you will see counties and townships, municipalities and school districts, service districts, and sometimes consolidation of government. When I was in law school, there was a big movement in Nashville to consolidate with the county. Nashville at that time was a very small city. My first year of law school in 1967, Nashville closed basically at 9 o'clock at night. Even the fast food places were closed at 9 o'clock at night. And so that what happened in 1968, they consolidated the city of Nashville with Davidson County. 3 cities did not join that consolidated government. So it's the government of Nashville and Davidson County. However, there are still other units of government even within that consolidated government. In Ohio, we have not had any consolidation of government or regional governments, and we still have counties, townships, municipalities, school districts, and special service districts, all of which pre-existed the rise of this complexity. And therefore, not only do we have complexity in population, we also have complexity in policy because now we have numerous governments involved. An example of that is Hamilton County. I just found it a better map than Cuyahoga County that I could find. And you can see the boundaries of different governmental units inside Hamilton County. In fact, if you look at the bottom part of where the word Hamilton is written, that's the city of Cincinnati. And you can see that Cincinnati surrounds some other cities. So there are cities within Cincinnati. I spent my teen years in Norwood, Ohio, which is one of those suburbs surrounded by Cincinnati. And the old saying was Norwood had no hospital and no cemetery. So you couldn't be born and you couldn't be buried in Norwood. But you can understand just looking at the map how complex things are going to be when you have that many units of government in one county. And in Cuyahoga County, we have, I think, about 180 different units of government today, each with different powers, each with a different history, each with its own politics. And it's very hard sometimes to deal with that, but it's also an advantage that we can talk about in a moment. So this map, to me, shows what complexity looks like geographically. What we're going to talk about is government and governance. Government is the structure, so that could be a municipality or a county. Governance is the process by which that structure makes and implements policies. I would argue that in government and governance, there are 4 major issues, especially pertinent to local government. One is the creation of units of local government. The other 3 relate to the operation of that government once created. Obviously, they need to be funded, and finding funding sources is very difficult. I just got contacted by a California law firm about the issue. Apparently, it's in California more than anywhere else. That's where a lot of things start, it seems, where municipalities are trying to tax streaming services that exist in the city. And that raises issues about the power of municipalities and what kind of funds or what kind of revenue would be legal for cities to have. The next one is regulation. How are these units of government run? What policies? How do they regulate whatever their clients or citizens are? And the last issue, which is a major issue in American government today at all levels, is accountability. How are actors in government, politicians and bureaucrats, held accountable? It's a very difficult issue. We watched that twice in the last presidential administration, where Trump was impeached twice. Not convicted, but impeached. And that impeachment is an accountability process where the legislature tries to hold the executive accountable. The difficulty with that impeachment shows how difficult it is to have accountability in current government. The result of all of this is we have structural and procedural complexity. Most people do not understand structures of government. That was the second part of this 3-part series, and we talked about different forms of municipal government, for example, and how counties are structured. addition to that, they have procedural complexity. We're watching that play out right now in Columbus, Ohio, where a teenager gets shot, and then the city has to do an investigation, and the process can be very complex. I was watching news today. There was a shooting in North Carolina. In Ohio, whatever video the police record is a public record. It is not a public record in North Carolina, and that's part of the complexity of our federal system. So they're bringing lawsuits in North Carolina in order to get access to the video. In Ohio, was provided by the city. But again, that depends on the procedure of the city, and that can be complex in addition to the structure. Let's talk about each of these four: creation, funding, regulation, and accountability, in that order. To create a unit of government requires changes in state law. As we noted in the first lecture, the courts have pretty much held that local government is a creature of state government. It's a creature of state government, not the federal government. The federal government has no direct authority over local government. The federal government can share authority, and they can obviously use grants and other things to affect policy in cities, but they do not control cities. It's controlled by state law. This is why it's been very difficult in some ways to watch police and holding police accountable, because what can happen depends upon the particular state law in which they are located. So the George Floyd case was not a federal court, it was a state court, and it involved a municipality. So to create any new government at the local level requires changes in state law. An example of changes was in 1912. This is during the first urban revolution, when Cleveland especially was growing very rapidly. Cincinnati has been the larger city prior to that. Cleveland passed Cincinnati during the 1900s, early 1900s, because it was an industrial city. And the issues were how to govern these cities and what should the relationship of the cities be to the state. In Ohio, they had a constitutional convention, as I mentioned in previous lectures. That's in the Ohio Constitution. That is, the issue of a constitutional convention is on the ballot every 20 years in Ohio. It's automatically on the ballot. Nobody has to put it on by petition. It's automatically on the ballot. In 1912, the citizens voted to have a constitutional convention. They met in Dayton, Ohio, and what they did was provide home rule, which we talked about previously. So home rule in Ohio is in the Ohio Constitution in Article 18. Home rule allows municipalities to create and implement their own city charters. Again, municipalities are corporations. They are public corporations. And as corporations, they need a charter, because charters specify what corporations can do. That's necessary because when people interact with corporations, you interact with specific people. However, those people do not have any liability for their action. The corporation does. So in order for you to be aware of what the corporation can and cannot do, you can look at its charter. Current issue in Ohio and most places is regional government. We talked about that in a few moments earlier as consolidated government. The adoption of the county charter in Cuyahoga County was really a movement by the Cleveland Plain Dealer and some local officials to create a regional government. And so even though Cuyahoga County has a charter, the charter allows it to change its structure, but not its authority. Cuyahoga County is not a municipality. That is, it does not have municipal authority. So we do not have a Cuyahoga County police force, for example. because it is not a municipality. They can adopt a charter, and the hope was, especially for the plain dealer, that that would lead to eventually regional government. So special districts, if they are to be created, they need to be created by state law. Ernie Bone, who started public housing, and the first public housing complex was in Cleveland. I always took my family to those kinds of places, and my kids hated it because they knew Dad was going to take them on a governmental journey, which they did not particularly enjoy. They would rather go to Cedar Point. We went to the first housing project in the United States. What Ernie Bone did was to get the state of Ohio to pass an enabling statute. That statute specifies how a local area could create a housing authority. And once the state government did that, Cuyahoga County then created a housing authority. So Cuyahoga CMHA is a creation again under state law, and that's how creations occur. Ohio would have to create regional governments. That is, they would have to empower counties, and they would have to terminate municipal authority in many cities. You can imagine how politically difficult that could be. And we'll talk in the end, we may not want to do that on other grounds. There's other issues involved. But in terms of actually being able to do that, it requires a state law that would allow it, and then dealing with the politics in the creation. Once created, governments need funding. They need some kind of revenue source. Schools in Ohio originally were funded by land sales. Jefferson designed the township that we talked about. Sections of the township were devoted to schools, and that's why you had the one-room schoolhouse sometimes in most townships around the state. I used to go to basketball games. I played basketball in high school, and the road behind Cincinnati Gardens was called School Section Road. And the reason it had that name is the road ran along the boundary line of the sections of land in the township that had been set aside for schools. State law creates governments. State law controls how they are funded. They are funded by taxes oftentimes, usually, fees, and then sometimes miscellaneous sources. An example I just talked about is where California cities are trying to tax streaming services in their boundaries. Fees, for example, could be the fare you pay to ride a bus in Cuyahoga County. RTA has a fare box, and it gives discounts to seniors. But again, that's an example of how funding issues are handled. Property tax was the main source of funding historically. The reason for that is prior to the Industrial Revolution, that is prior to the first urban revolution in the United States, wealth was in property. One of the main reasons immigrants came to the United States is that land was available. And after the Civil War, land was free as long as you developed it and lived on it for a certain period of time. That's very unusual around the world, and it accounted for a lot of the immigration to the United States. There's also tax levies that are based on the property tax. Levies will determine how much of a tax is on the value of your property. This is why counties, which are administrative units, do the property evaluations. And they will send you a form noting what the value of your property, and what part of that value is taxable. And they will also provide a process by which you could contest that evaluation. That's an example of complexity in procedural. The Industrial Revolution changed the nature of wealth. in societies. Land is not now the main source of wealth. The main source of wealth is investments and other kinds of income that people get in an industrial society. My parents, who were only high school graduates, in fact, I think I mentioned before, my dad only finished high school. He'd actually quit in the 11th grade, but mom would not marry him if he didn't complete his high school degree. And so he did. However, he worked for 40 years with the Cincinnati Bell, the smallest of the bell companies in the United States. And there were 31 bell companies. And the bell company had a employee stock option. And my parents bought as much of that stock as they could. They would buy other shares from other people who didn't want to buy shares. As a result, when my parents retired, they owned over 40,000 shares of Cincinnati Bell. And that stock went to $40 a share. Cincinnati Bell changed its name, became more of an internet company, spun off another company, and for every share that people had in Cincinnati Bell, they got a share of the new company. So all of a sudden, my parents had 80,000 shares of stock, and all of them worth $40 a share. That's wealth in modern times. So my parents owned a home, but the home was a small amount of their overall wealth compared to what they got in investments. In Ohio, in recognition of that, the 1972 under Governor Gilligan, Ohio had the first income tax. And the state has an income tax levied on income. The tax at the local level, I pay taxes to Lakewood. That's actually a wage tax. It's not an income tax. It's only paid on wages. And therefore it is incurred wherever the wages are earned. So I worked at Cleveland State University, so I paid tax to Cleveland on my full salary. And then I also owed tax to Lakewood because I resided in Lakewood. And my wife works in Hamilton, Ohio. Between the two of us, we pay wage taxes to 4 units of government. Tax season is quite an exercise in our household. In recognition of the unpopularity of taxation, Ohio has a lot of state regulations, some in the Ohio Constitution, on the amount of taxation that local governments can do. It's an example, again, of the procedural complexity, and it makes it very difficult sometimes for units of government to raise revenue because it can be controlled by and limited by state government. Regulation is how do these policies get implemented by all of these local governments. We'll just give some examples of that. You've got zoning, obviously, is an example of control by local government. Municipalities have zoning authority. They can say what and how property can be used for. Planning and economic development is usually a local effort. Again, it's the use of land. The government can take property by eminent domain. That is, the government, for public purposes, can force people to sell their land. They will pay at least market value for that land, usually more than market value for that land. But if the seller doesn't want to sell, they can take them to court and do eminent domain. Also, what's coming about in climate change, floodplains, energy in the future are going to be issues of regulation. For example, Houston has had 2 1,000-year storms in 2 years. What they're doing now is changing the map of Houston and a much larger part of Houston is now going to be part of floodplains. What does that mean? If you have a house located on what is now a floodplain, it is much more difficult to get insurance. That's why the federal government offers a flood insurance, because it's very expensive otherwise. By the city of Houston changing what is considered a floodplain, that obviously affects the value of housing. And that's regulation. That's how does local units of government enforce their policies. They can make and enforce policies through a variety of mechanisms, and how they're created and how they are implemented is an example of procedural complexity. Accountability is probably the most difficult issue in modern government. Mayors, presidents, and other executive action has proven very difficult to hold accountable. It's very difficult to impeach a president. Many charters in Ohio, probably most charters in Ohio, provide a way for a mayor to be removed from office. However, that is very difficult to do and requires a collection of signatures and going through a recall election. Cleveland tried to recall Kucinich, and Kucinich was not recalled, but it was an election. Also, because of the progressive movement at the turn of the 20th century, that is during the first urban revolution, we had to look at how to govern all of this new growth and complexity. Many of them provided for local democracy through petitions and referendums. So in Lakewood, for example, the city charter allows citizens to propose an ordinance, and they do that by collecting a certain amount of signatures, and then that ordinance will get put on the ballot and go to a referendum. It's an example of local democracy. There's also the same process at the state level in Ohio. It's part of the Ohio Constitution. As a result of all this complexity and why it's so difficult to hold, especially local governments, accountable, is a typical American pays taxes to 11 governments. And they are somewhat independent governments. You see the list there of part of the units to which I pay taxes. I pay a federal income tax. I pay a state income tax. I pay a state sales tax. I pay sales tax in Cuyahoga County. And Cuyahoga County collects property taxes for all local governments. And so what I owe the Lakewood City Schools, what I owe the city of Lakewood in terms of property tax is collected by Cuyahoga County and then returned to those units of government. This is why counties are tasked with creating a map that shows all the ownership of property within the county, because that depends upon your tax liability. RTA has a 1% sales tax. So I pay a sales tax for public transportation. Every time I use it, I also pay. So they have two different revenue sources, and they still have problems trying to run the service. School tax levies are very unusual. When the levy passes, it's a certain amount of property will be taxed at a certain rate. If the property goes up in value, more money is paid under that levy. However, school levies are capped at whatever revenue they get in the first year. They're the only levies that are capped. This is why school levies tend to be on the ballot every few years. When schools pass a levy, they are limited to whatever the levy generated in the first year. And that could really be lost revenue. Lakewood is a really good example. When I bought my home was worth $68,000. It is now worth almost $200,000. The school will get no benefit of that increased value because the tax levy is capped. Why is it capped? State law. House Bill 920. This is an example, and it's a quote from the county treasurer's website, and I'll let you read it. I won't read it to you, but it shows again where taxes go and how the county, because the county is an administrative unit, not a policy-making unit, they will collect all of these different taxes, and then they will allocate them to the different governments mentioned in this statement from the county treasurer. Again, you want to take more time to look at that or whatever, you can look at the YouTube video that'll be posted later. 10 mills, and 10 mills are a percentage of a hundredth of a penny. 10 mills of unvoted taxes are guaranteed by the Ohio Constitution. So governments can have 10 mills of a levy without any vote or any other procedure. If it's more than 10 mills, oftentimes it requires an election or some kind of mechanism by which that can occur. For a city, it may require amending the city charter, and that any amendment to a city charter will also go to a vote. Again, it's procedural complexity, obviously, and it really makes it difficult to hold governments accountable because it's hard sometimes to know just what is the unit of government, how is it funded, and how is it created. This is a quick walkthrough of a very complex subject. I think local government is critical in the United States. It's the government closest to the people. I really regret that state and local governments lack effective media coverage. People probably know more about what is going on in Washington, D.C. than they know what is going on in their own city hall. And I think that's really unfortunate because you can affect what goes on in City Hall much easier than what goes on in Washington. But there's no real media coverage. It makes it difficult to hold people accountable, and it makes it difficult for people to even understand local government. And local government can be empowered. Municipalities are corporations. As I think I mentioned before, Cincinnati could not get railroads to build from the south and bridge the river. Cincinnati built their own railroad to Lexington, Kentucky. They still own it. They lease it to the CSX line, and it's a great revenue source for the city. Cities as corporations can do that. I would like to see the NFL, for example, give 25% of the stock of every NFL franchise to the city. And therefore, if a franchise wanted to move, it would have to buy its stock back from the city. Can cities do that? Yes, they are corporations. They can own stock. Our major difficulty is the misinformation, the myth, especially about local government. People do not understand a municipality. In fact, the word itself is unknown to most people. And they tend to, oftentimes, they being different groups of people, listen to information without any background or context. And unfortunately, social media tends to emphasize trending of information rather than the validity of the information. And I think that's a very difficult part of trying to govern in the United States today. The trade-off, if we consolidate governments to make them more efficient, the trade-off is efficiency versus participation. When I was a young academic and just got my degree, I believed in consolidation. I really valued efficiency. Over time, I began to value participation more. I think a lot of Americans feel that government is not for them because they don't participate and they don't have opportunities to participate. So one of the reasons I am not a fan of regional government in Ohio is that if Cuyahoga County became the basic municipality in in which I would live, I would have 11-member council. In contrast, Cuyahoga County has 54 municipalities, and they provide 474 council seats. Two of my students are now on the council in Lakewood, and they can do that with a minimal amount of funding because it's local government. However, we pay a price for that. We do have many governments, and they have only voluntary, sometimes, relationships among governments, and that can change depending on who controls the offices in that government. Complexity is both a protection and a confusion. I think the last presidential election is an example of where I like a complex electoral system. We have 50 different electoral systems in the United States. And I watched Georgia count the votes 3 times, watch in the general sense. I obviously wasn't in Georgia. And I think that is better protection than the federal government controlling the election. I would have a lot of hesitation had President Trump been able to directly have input in the election. However, complexity does cause confusion. People do not understand what unit of government can do what. And civics courses have tended to disappear from high school curriculums, and I think that's a major mistake because I do think complexity is protection. Finally, ignorance imperils both our politics and our liberty. People do not know government. They do not understand government. They're oftentimes easily persuaded that government is not for them. It's not created for them. Government is the way which we as a community make policy. That means I am part of many communities. I'm part of a national community, a state community, and local communities. And I like that. I like being able to participate at different levels. And I liked what happened when they disagree. Dealing with the pandemic was an illustration of how important it was to have state governments that could take action when the national government would not, or when the national government leadership decided to ignore the advice of experts on how to deal with the pandemic. I'd like to thank everybody who joined in these sessions, whether it was one or all 3 sessions. I really appreciate that. Special thanks goes to Julia Fisher. She's the, I think, head of special projects for Twinsburg Public Library. Someday I hope to actually see the inside of that library. She and the staff did an excellent job hosting all of this. They are an example. Public libraries and public schools, to me, are the backbone of American liberty and opportunity. They have provided, as one of the few countries in the world, free education to the age of 18, and you can get any book, practically any book ever printed, from your local library. You can't do that in most countries around the world. Try doing that in China or Russia. You can't do it. And again, these are local institutions, and yet they are incredibly important to our general liberty and opportunity. And the last thing is an exhortation to you and to everyone else: protect the future, stay informed, and participating. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Keller. We will now enter our Q&A session, so feel free to type your comments into the Q&A box, and we will get to as many as we can before our time is up. These can be questions about what we've covered today or more questions about local government in general. So I'll give everyone a few minutes to type up any questions.
Every presenter hopes it's so well done, there's no questions, right?
You know, it could be.
That should never be the case.
Well, while people are potentially typing, I'll go ahead and just give our closing remarks and let everyone continue typing away. So thank you so much, everyone. If you enjoyed this program, please check out the other virtual programs we have planned at the Twinsburg Public Library. You can visit our website at www.twinsburglibrary.org to see our calendar of events as well as the hours that the library is open. If you have any questions or comments about tonight's program or any of the previous programs, please email me at jfisher@twinsburglibrary.org. I believe that all of you here tonight were present for one or both of our previous sessions, so I would especially love to hear your thoughts and feedback about this series and what sort of programs you'd like to see in the future. Dr. Keller was also kind enough to offer his email to you as well, so I will put both of our emails in the chat box in just a moment. Thank you to the Friends of the Library for funding tonight's program, and a very special thanks to Dr. Keller for all three of these sessions. All right, I will check again. I still don't see anything. So thank you all for being here. Dr. Keller, thank you again, and I hope all of you have a wonderful evening.
Thank you, Julie, and thanks everybody for attending. My
Thank
pleasure.
you.